Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 5th annual editorial workshop, Getting Published, Getting Read. This workshop is part of the Arts and Humanities Research Platform, Mentorship and Research Series, and it's organized by the HRF in collaboration with Arts and Humanities and the Center for Faculty Advancement. So I'm going to first thank our two speakers for being here, Niels Hooper and Dr. Marissa Mika, and I'll introduce them. And then I'll ask them some questions and we'll get into a conversation for about 40 minutes, which is why I need a timer. And then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So first, thank you both for being here. First, Niels Hooper is executive editor at University of California Press, where he acquires books in modern US history, Middle East studies, and world history. Prior to joining the press 20 years ago, he was general manager of Verso Books in New York. Some recent highlights from his Middle East studies list include On Barak's Heat, a history lessons from the Middle East for a warming planet, Sari Maqdisi's Tolerance is a Wasteland, Palestine and the Culture of Denial, Lisa Hajjar's The War in Court, Inside the Long Fight Against Torture, Mark Levine's We'll Play Till We Die, Journeys Across a Decade of Revolutionary Music in the Muslim World, and Lucia Carminati's Seeking Bread and Fortune in Port Said. Many of his world history books also cover the Middle East in a global context, including recently Nathaniel Matthews' Zanzibar Was a Country, Exile and Citizenship Between East Africa and the Gulf, and our very own Gunja Sengupta and Awam Amka's book, Sojourners, Sultans and Slaves, America and the Indian Ocean in the Age of Abolition and Empire. He is interested in acquiring more books on the Arab Gulf and recently published Rana al-Mutawa's Everyday Life in the Spectacular City, Making Home in Dubai. He also has many books from several former HRF fellows, including Asmat al-Halabi's recently published Parting Gifts of Empire, Palestine and India at the Dawn of Decolonization, and forthcoming titles by Chris Lowe and Burak Saim. He also has a couple of other Gulf Indian Ocean related books forthcoming from Fahad Bshara and Nicholas Roberts. Thank you for being here, Niels. Next, Dr. Marissa Mika is a writer and editor living in Berkeley for the time being, California, where she runs the editorial practice. As a developmental editor, she works with scholarly authors to transform their brilliant research into big, beautiful, bold books. As a writing coach, she works with authors to remove obstacles, ignite the passion, and get it done. As a scholar who blends history and ethnography in her own writing and research, she's interested in how to bring interdisciplinary work to life on the page. She particularly enjoys working with early career scholars who are making the challenging but exhilarating transition from dissertation to first book. Subject area specialties include the history and anthropology of science, medicine and technology, critical global health, and African history. Before taking an early retirement from academia in 2020, Dr. Mika was the founding director of the Medical Humanities Program at the University of Global Health Equity in Rwanda. Between 2016 and 2018, she held a Wellcome Trust postdoctoral fellowship on chronic disease in Africa at UCL, University College London. Trained as a historian and anthropologist of medicine, science, and technology in Africa, she has a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in the history and sociology of science and an MHS in international health from Johns Hopkins. She's the author of Africanizing Oncology, Creativity, Crisis, and Cancer in Uganda, which was a finalist for both the ASA Best Book Prize and the Bethwell A. Ogat Award for Best Book in East African Studies in 2022. So welcome to you both. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to ask you questions and we can go back and forth. So maybe first a question to you, Niels, about the role of your role. So could you start by explaining what an acquisitions editor does and what falls outside the scope of your role? And maybe if you can tell us give us a bit of an overview of UC Press, its strength, editorial approach, the kinds of books it tends to publish, and perhaps if there's been some changes recently that you have noted.
It's a lot of questions.
Sorry.
No, that's good. Yes, I think it's the question about what an acquisitions editor does is an important one because there's a lot of misunderstandings out there. I am responsible for, or we are responsible for acquiring books for the press, but we have very little time to focus on new, especially unsolicited manuscripts. Within the press, within UC Press, I don't think this is true of other university presses, we're called sponsors. So we become the kind of the sponsor for the project within the press, really kind of almost the agent for the author amongst our colleagues. So once I'm interested in a book and I peer review it and then bring it forward to the press for a contract, which is the acquisitions part of it, then I become the kind of point person for the book within the press through the whole process, on behalf of the author, really. So even though it gets passed on to a production editor, which will take care of the copy editing. So there's lots of editorial parts of the process that are not parts that I directly do, but I'm sort of the point person for the copy editor, for the production editor, for the designer, for the marketing book, for choosing the title of the book, for choosing creating the pitch for the book, for the way that it goes out into the world. So even though there are other departments of the press that handle that, I'm the sort of the person between, or the editor is the person between the author and all of the parts of the press that handle the book in-house. And that takes up, that care and management of the book from when it comes in to when it goes out into the world takes up most, I would say. So I wish I had more time to be out there just looking for new projects and reading unsolicited manuscripts and proposals. And but I have to squeeze that into a fraction of the time. I do go to a lot of conferences. I do travel as much as I can to meet people and talk about their research and their projects. And that's an exciting, I always have said that it's a kind of, I feel like it's a fake job in the sense that I get paid to just talk to fascinating people about their research one-on-one. I don't have to go to their classes or, and so it's sort of a dream, and that I, hop around subjects as well. And I'm not the expert of nothing, and I rely on peer reviewers a lot for that part of the vetting process. But I get a very broad sense, I think, of the scope of the fields and the questions that are being asked and the directions that things are moving, and especially wearing a Middle East Studies hat and a American history hat and a world history hat, it's really sort of fascinating to me to see how scholars that are often siloed from each other are actually kind of speaking. I forgot the other parts of the
Just a
question.
general overview of the
UC
press.
Yeah. I think this is important too. When you're looking for a publisher, there are very many different types of publishers and different sizes and specialties that publishers do. We are one of the 6 biggest American university presses. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Chicago, MIT, California. Oxford and Cambridge are in a kind of a massive league.
Duke is not in that list.
Sorry?
Duke would not be in that list?
Not of one of the big 6, yeah. But in certain areas, they're the strongest. That's not an indication of strength. It's just how many books and the sort of the finances. And we're the only one of the 6 that's associated with a public university, and we take that very seriously. I think we have a more progressive, avowedly kind of progressive mission than Harvard or Yale or Princeton, who just say they publish the best scholarship, which is part of the process too. So we're progressive, we're large. I think the advantage of the size of UC Press is that we can do both trade books for the general public and scholarly monographs. I think it's a little harder for some of the small university presses to effectively do trade books, except in their region. But there are advantages with going to a small press. There's more hand-holding, there's more care that could be given to every book. I think sometimes with a place like Oxford, it's such a massive operation that authors can get lost in that process. We publish in the humanities and social sciences largely. We do have a natural science list. And we've sort of chosen areas that we believe we're in the top 3 of to focus on and strengthen fields, and then moved away from others that we weren't. We don't do philosophy, we don't do poetry anymore. So it's worth looking at what a press does recently when you're thinking about that book. We used to, when I started at the press 20 years ago, we had a very strong sort of revolutionary Europe list, French Revolution. We don't do that at all anymore. So even if you look at sort of what a publisher did 20 years ago, that might not be what they're strong at now. But then the other thing that I think distinguishes us a little bit is that we have an anthropology editor, we have a history editor, we have a sociology editor, we have a law and criminology editor, but we all see ourselves as working in an interdisciplinary way in interdisciplinary fields that we all feel a part of our mission. So we all publish books on immigration, on race, on sexuality, on the environment, whether we're doing history or so we share the sort of strengths between us.
That's great. Thank you so much. And Marissa, for you, I wanted to ask you if you can describe to us what developmental editing is, and what your work typically involves.
Sure. I'm just writing this down because I don't know about you, but I actually am very sieve-like and still need to write everything down. So I would say that there are often a couple of different kinds of editors. There's an acquisitions editor, which Niels is. There are developmental editors who think about kind of the big picture structural issues of a manuscript and the ways in which I like to think of what a developmental editor does is looking at all of the puzzle pieces that are out on the table and saying, well, it looks like you have the edge pieces here, right? Here's your argument. But it looks like the image that you wound up making, maybe there are some pieces that actually need to be rearranged. And wouldn't it be more effective if we switch things around and then suddenly, oh, look, all of the puzzle pieces of the book are falling into place. And then there are also copy editors. So people who are extraordinarily adept both at thinking about language and flow and grammar usage and down to the fine minutiae of punctuation. And I will say that I am not detail-oriented in that way, and I'm actually a terrible copy editor. I don't know if acquisitions editors are also like sometimes like, and so I would say that, and then what I find that I wind up doing with authors is I help them put together their pieces. And this will be very different, I would say, for first book writers and kind of like more long-term second or third project scholars. With the colleagues that I work with who are working on their first books, usually what I will do is we'll start with, and I would say that perhaps in contrast to a lot of developmental editors, I'm very conversational in the sense that I like to actually have multiple conversations with a colleague over perhaps a series of weeks or even months, maybe 2 to 3 meetings to actually understand what they hope the book will be. What I will do is I will usually read the manuscript once very quickly, send them 1,000 words worth of comments, questions, things that I see, things that I want to know more about. we'll have an hour-long conversation, and then based on that conversation, I will read through the manuscript again very quickly, and then see what I've missed in terms of thinking about how it all hangs together. And then I'll send another round of questions and comments and thoughts, and then we'll have a second conversation. And then it's really kind of in the third round, the third iteration, where feedback starts to come together. And then I will synthesize and consolidate that feedback that is anywhere from like a 5-page to a 15-page editorial letter that will delineate suggestions about where the manuscript can go, ideas for how to shape the book proposal, general things that I'll see with colleagues over and over and over again who are trying to sit down and work on a page. So that's kind of like one style, one style of work that I engage in, just a lot of conversational and iterative feedback. The other thing that I find myself doing more and more, particularly in this political environment, is to basically stand with the boulder and help the author push it up the hill. It seems to me that in the past year, there's just more and more external noise, both coming from the institution and then also coming from broader political landscape, particularly with colleagues who are working in the US full-time. And then just the environment and then just kind of the working constraints of trying to ascertain how to be an educator and a person of ethics and kind of purpose and focus in an environment where you really do, I joke, well, who's in the newsroom? Because things are changing every day and changing rapidly. So by anchoring colleagues in a once a week or once a month conversation, reading what is coming in, asking questions, checking in, maybe even like a little bit of woo by sharing like a beautiful poem, that's come through both of our circuits, or, like that one gorgeous song that will keep you going. More and more, I do find myself working as a thought partner as well as a developmental editor. And in the future, I think in this coming year, for whatever reason, 90% of the colleagues that I work with is women, and I don't know to what extent that's gendered. I don't know to what extent that is just about or just about the sorts of projects that I find myself interested in. But I'm also more and more interested in working with people who may have left the academy, who may be sitting with a manuscript in their drawer, or people who are working at the intersection of, say, intellectual work and thought leading work, and are looking for partners in shaping proposals and in shaping the development of manuscripts that can then be shopped around to agents and publishing houses. Just also as a diversification strategy. I think that one of the interesting things about being a freelance editor is that you're writing on the coattails of grants and the financial resources that your colleagues have access to, and then figuring out a work package that will that will support that kind of heavier touch. And I will say that there are developmental editors who work with a very light touch, where they will just read your manuscript once, send you 5 to 10 pages worth of editorial feedback, kind of like a mini peer review. But I really like to get to know people and where they're coming from. So yeah, I guess I also just spend a lot of time talking with really brilliant people working on and hoping that there will be a gorgeous 80,000 word object on the other side of our collaboration.
That's great. It's so nice to hear both of you reflect on this and the human dimension of it, because sometimes when we're writing or we have deadlines, it stops feeling like we're trying to say something and more like we have to say it within a time limit, which I know I felt when I was writing my book. So maybe I'll ask you a question to both of you about the transformation of a dissertation into a book, because I think that was very challenging for me to do. I didn't have, I wasn't lucky enough to have guidance from people who've been doing this for a while. So what would you say are some of the common challenges that authors face when making that transformation, and what's an advice you would give them about how to approach it in general? Like, what should they be avoiding in that transformation?
I think that you said something just now about taking yourself out of the book, or the human approach. That made me think that is one of the challenges, I think, of transferring a dissertation into a book. And I always, when I talk to people, and it's been great being here the last couple of days and talking to people, I get something out of the conversation that is not in their book proposal or not in their manuscript, about why they wrote the book, about what the passion that they have for the project, or the sort of stakes of the project that are for them. And that sort of, I feel that needs to come in. That's sort of, at graduate school, you're taught to be objective and to sort of remove that and be kind of more scientific about it. And I think it helps the reader to get a feeling for that in the book manuscript. So I do think that putting, you don't have to make it about you, the manuscript, but getting a sense in the manuscript of why the book is important, and not just a sort of artifact of knowledge production, is one of, and so becoming the author, in a dissertation, again, you're hiding behind William Germano, who has a bunch of books that are worth looking up if you want to transform a dissertation into a book. I think they're called, I wrote it down. But it's from dissertation to book, getting it published, on revision. He has 3 books out. But he called the dissertation a paranoid genre. You're hiding behind, everybody else, and you're not saying what you want to say. So I think that is developing your own authorial voice, and letting the reader find out who you are and what you've learned and what you want to impart, and not what everybody else has written on the subject. So getting rid of that literature chapter completely at the beginning of the dissertation, I think, is essential. There are lots of other aspects, but
in addition, so I would say that finding and accessing voice, and like a voice of scholarly authority, is often issue number 1 that I see. But issue number, maybe I would say that about 90% of the dissertations that land on my desk, I would call them, like a guided tour of the evidence, right? So there's a way, I think, especially in history writing, and especially in early history draft writing, especially like history dissertations, where you feel like you're on a guided tour of the archive. And here you may see the argument, like on page 10, I'm giving it to you in 1 sentence, and now we're going to forget about it, because what I really want to do is show you filing cabinet 27 that I found, like, in this one place. And look at how cool this like annual report is. And I think that one of the really interesting things about a lot of dissertations is that I think they wind up being these expository documents that allow you to deeply engage with what you did and what you found, and then communicating that to an audience of 4. And that audience of 4 is an audience of 4 that you have really complicated kinship relationships with. There might be daddy issues, there might be mommy issues, there might be sibling issues. He likes my other like cohort person more than me. So there's all of this like wound up stuff tied into this document. And then I think, especially with interdisciplinary projects, which are my favorites to work with, there's also the question of like, well, who am I, like, where, like, what is the, like, what's what's the melody and what's the harmony, or like what's the melody and the harmony, so to speak, or like what's the, like what is really what's guiding this and moving this forward? Bad musical metaphors, and I know we have a musician in the audience, so there's this, so I think that, so that's 90% of what I see. And then the other 10% of the books, of the dissertations that I see are baby books. And the reason why they're baby books is that they are answering a research question, and each of the chapters are organized in some way around answering that question. So there might be a chapter that's out of place, or some parts of it might be less developed, or there's certainly still more character work to do. But you can tell that they have a story that they want to tell you. And so what I do with the 90%, is we figure out what is the, the question then is, well, what's the argument and what's the question? What did I really want this document to answer? So that's kind of like big thing one. And then big issue two, I would say, is then having enough separation from your committee and having enough separation from graduate student training to begin to build out a scholarly voice that is yours alone. And then there's also just the third question, I would say, especially for interdisciplinary colleagues, really making a decision about who you want the core contribution to be with, and where do you want to place your book? Because I think that there can also be, I don't know if you see this with first authors, but I see a lot of like first author people pleasing, where it's like you've had that one conversation with that one editor at that one conference, and then you think, oh, well, crap, they said this to me in passing, this is what I should do. And then they'll spend like 6 months to a year trying to make that happen. And then you realize that it was actually just a miscommunication, that the editor saw 20 other people there that day, maybe didn't give you exactly the advice that you wanted, but because you're still in this mode of submitting to a higher authority and you're not grounded enough in and your vision for the project, that you will just go around in circles. So breaking out of those circles is also, I think, one of the biggest challenges of moving from dissertation to book.
I am just building on some of that. The dissertation exists, and it's findable and usable. And I think, it's a sort of simple fact. Everybody knows it. I don't think I'm showing something new, but everybody that I say that to said, oh, that really helped me, because then the book can become what you want it to be. You can get rid of that chapter that doesn't really fit, or that long, Hani and Shahada said that to me yesterday about her book. She said, when you told me that, and then I felt able to sort of merge these chapters, because I want the book to be shorter. Yeah, I think just remembering that is important. In terms of sort of interdisciplinary work for falling between the gaps instead of sort of hitting all of the audiences, I do think when we pitch books to, in fact, our sales conference was yesterday. We pitch books to a sales force. It's a very old-fashioned industry that actually go out and pitch to bookstores and to book reviewers at the New York Times and everywhere else, and sit down with a catalog. And you get seconds to pitch each book to the book buyers, the book reviewers. I get 5 minutes to pitch it to each book to the sales reps. They get seconds to pitch it. So if you can, my old boss at Verso used to tell me, if you can't describe a book in a sentence, it's not a book. And that's a kind of ruthless idea, I guess, for somebody who's finished their dissertation, because it's doing 10 things and it's brilliant in all of these areas. But ultimately, that hook, that one sentence hook, that little elevator pitch, is what's going to sell the book, make people remember it, make people realize what that book did. And then it does 10 other things as well, but you subsume those other things under the one.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you both. I'm gonna follow up and maybe we can start with you, Niels, and then I'll link it to the work you do, Marissa. But just the practicalities of the publication process, the stages, what people should be expecting at every stage. Let's say we stick to the dissertation manuscript proposal book, or even just manuscript book. What advice would you give about these stages, what to expect of them?
Yes, I mean, it's good to approach, I'll just sort of quickly run through, sort of structure of it. I think it's good to approach an editor once you have a sense of how you want to revise the dissertation into a book, and you've already actually sort of sketched out a book proposal for the book, not the dissertation, and probably revised at least a couple of the chapters, to have a couple of sample chapters. I think there is a danger, and I've talked to people here over the last few days that sort of pitched a little too early and got an editor interested, and then didn't have the material to sort of follow up later, because 2 years or 3 years later, we might forget why we thought this was great, or, you know, you sort of want to keep the momentum going. Once, especially for a first book, once we have material to peer review, you know, once I send a book out for peer review, I want to do it. I'm on your side. I want it to work. I'm investing my time and energy into the project, and I want to choose. The sort of choice of peer reviewers is with the acquisitions editor. I ask authors for their suggestions, but ultimately I'm looking for people that I think will get it, that are also on your side, and improve it. So it's not, I mean, people are scared about that process, obviously, but it's constructive. And I want it to be constructive, and I'm trying to tailor it to that. We used to ask for a full manuscript for first books, but I think increasingly, partly because we're competing against Duke or whatever, we will peer review 2 or 3 chapters, depending on, I always say, depending on what's most useful for the author. So if you've revised 3 chapters and you want to know whether you're doing the right thing, and we want feedback not just from the editor and the press, but from peer reviewers, that's a useful place to peer review. And I'll still have to peer review a full manuscript later, but we can offer you a contract based on the peer review of half a manuscript, if it reviews well. You know, once we issue a contract, then we have a date in the contract for when we want all the revisions done. That's in consultation with the authors. And, you know, depending on your teaching load, you know, family obligations, whatever else you have going on, that date sort of is shorter or longer, but that doesn't matter. But then once the book comes in, it gets passed on to, you know, I look at it again, check all the permissions and art, all the details, and then we pass it on to a production department, and a production editor will handle that, the next part of the process, and give a very detailed schedule to the author, you know, when to expect copy edits, to expect page proofs, when it will be printed, you know, what the publication dates, all of that. Early on in the process of that process, sort of actually before we put it into production, you know, we're working on the final cover and title for the book, because we have to put it in our catalog 6 months to a year before it publishes. So that is all very mechanical and very tight, that part of the process. At some point between, you know, maybe peer review, finishing the manuscript, revisions, when the manuscript is back at, you know, on your desks, you can or cannot, you know, enlist the support of the developmental editor. So in the press, there's the acquisitions editor that will look at the sort of big picture issues, maybe focus on certain sections of the manuscript, especially ones that peer reviewers raise red flags about, or you have questions about, but we don't just have enough time to do all the detailed developmental editing work, which either falls then on you or on, you know, you in consultation with the developmental editor. But it will be copy edited by a copy editor in the press.
That's really great. Thank Thank you. Very clear. And actually, that's a great segue to what I wanted to ask you, which is, for you, what is the point at which developmental editing becomes really important, whether we're thinking dissertation, a book, or even second book? And then how would you describe the rewriting process? I know for me, rewriting is something that gives me a lot of anxiety, like when I think about it as a, so how would you describe it from your own experience with people you've worked with, or how you approach it, breaking it down, stages, steps, that kind of advice or perspective?
Right, so on that first question about like where and how it's can be helpful to work with a developmental editor, I think that it's often like in places of stuckness.
Yeah.
So, a classic place of stuckness is looking at your dissertation and then saying, how on earth am I going to begin to shape this into a book? And then maybe the next place of stuckness is, oh, I know that I've now like reworked the dissertation, but I don't know how to turn this into a book proposal. Or now I've received peer review feedback and wow, this one peer reviewer just did not get it at all. And now I feel really stuck. How am I going to proceed? I know that my editor is still on my side. And then maybe one final place where you might see it is it's the 11th hour and your editor writes back to you and says, this is great, but can you please rewrite the introduction? And you can do that either by getting an Airbnb instance of each or contacting your developmental editor, both work. In terms of the rewriting process, I would just say that I think that writing like exercise is something that winds up being a lot easier to do if you're in some sort of shape for it. And I think that at least I found that in the rewriting stage in my own personal practice, it just requires this sort of sitting in a chair and making a commitment every day to just say that it's going to be done. I think that one thing that I do see with early career scholars or people who are fresh out of graduate school is that depending on the habits that you may have had, like if it's like burritos and cigarettes and staying up at 2 o'clock in the morning, to 6 o'clock in the morning, in a very sudden burst of activity, that's probably not going to be the thing that's going to get your rewriting process through, or even your writing. So I think that a lot of what I try to impart with colleagues who are interested is to kind of tailor Julia Cameron's artist's way to the scholarly writer's way. So there's an admixture of things that you can do, whether that's handwritten morning pages, whether that's working with Pomodoros, whether that is audio transcribing ideas that may be stuck in your head on a walk. Maybe it involves having a writing group. There are many different ways in which I think we can strengthen writing so that it's more like a practice and that it might be more of a diversified practice, right? So it's like, okay, I have my cardio, I have my strength, and then I have my flexibility, and I think part of the rewriting process can also be a reading practice, which is, say, reading a gorgeous novel alongside your writing and perhaps reanimating a relationship with language and kind of the power of articulation and exposition and things of beauty, which can also go by the wayside. So those are just some of the strategies.
That's great. Thank you so much. Well, maybe one final question, and then we can open it up for Q&A, but it's a similar question for both of you. How would you describe a productive working relationship between, in your case, an acquisitions editor and author, and with you, between you as a developmental editor and the author? Is there sort of general practice involved? I'm sure there are many scenarios that are not very comfortable. So maybe just generally, if you can talk to us about that.
yeah, I wrote down peer review because we talked about, you just brought up peer review, but that kind of is a segue into
Yeah.
one of my answers for this, because I do think that it's really important to find an acquisitions editor that gets your project.
Yeah.
And that sort of is the core of the working relationship, I think, you know, it's at least as important as whether the press is, you know, it's the top press in that area or biggest press or whatever, getting the editor that really gets what you want to do with it. And you know, this was a long way of sort of saying that you can push back against peer reviews. I just want to, you know, if you do get that nasty peer review and you and the editor agree that, and this is part of sort of the editor getting your project, that the author, the peer reviewer didn't get it or is trying to write their own book on the subject that is not the book that you want to write, it's perfectly legitimate to push back against those parts of the peer review, as long as the press is on board with that as well. So in every stage, I think it's crucial that the good, you know, a good working relationship is when the editor gets it, and, sort of, because as I said at the beginning, it's, you know, we're going to be an important part of choosing the title of the book, the cover, the way it's shaped, the way it goes out, and the way it's pitched to the world, and the ultimate success of it. You know, I think that, I wonder what I would say about the rest of the working relationship. You know, I think just being communicative, and I have a lot on my plate, so I'm not always getting back to people immediately, but not being afraid to, you know, if the editor doesn't get back to you, just sort of shooting them another line, saying, you know, even at the submission stage and later on during the process, you know, bugging the editor is totally fine. I think that if a lot of people are worried about, I mean, I shouldn't say this because we do want manuscripts to come in a timely fashion. But unless it's tied to a specific event or the anniversary of 9/11 or something, you know, whatever, it's not in the end a huge deal. So just being very open, you know, not being afraid of sort of saying, I discovered all this new information, my manuscript's going to be 3 months later, and just being sort of upfront with the editor about that. We can rearrange those things, even though the contract sort of says that we can cancel your contract if you don't deliver on time. We're really not going to do that. As long as you're open and honest with the editor.
Thanks.
Well, I would say that the most difficult clients I've had have been colleagues who expect who on some level hope that I will do the work for them.
Yeah.
And that can take on many forms, right? That can take on like, well, why am I not writing this? And then saying, well, what kind of, like, how are you structuring your time? And like, how are you, you know, tell me about your writing process. And then you find out that they're just not writing. You know, or it's giving kind of consistent feedback and saying this needs more, and then being met with anger, whether that is about this needs a deeper theoretical contribution. I suggest that you read in this literature. Why don't we put together a list of 20 books, you know, that you can lightly digest, and then that will add some robustness. So I would say that when I meet that level of resistance, it's usually about something else, and you're probably not ready to work with, you're probably not yet ready to work on the manuscript. There are probably just things that you need to be working on in yourself, whether that's like therapist or like an undiagnosed like ADHD situation, you know, any of these things. A person's only going to be able to help you remove blockages on the writing if you've already worked with those things that might be in the background that are making it very difficult to get to the desk in the first place. The best working relationships that I've had are just ones where I feel where we are learning so much from each other, and there is slow and steady progress, and on the other side of it, the full potential of the manuscript comes forth. And I think that there's a way in which so much of this is quiet and iterative. It sometimes feels like nothing is happening. And then suddenly there is something that happens. You know, you get a contract, or you're in production, or your proofs have come in. And I think it's holding the faith that if we just get up and work diligently and collaboratively and communicatively, we will make something gorgeous out of this work. But it's hard, like these things, like it's so much easier to gestate an elephant than make a scholarly book. Like, yeah.
I mean, it's teamwork, you know, you really need to be in the team, and not just with the editor, but certainly with the developmental editor, but with them, you know, once the book comes out, with the marketing team and the publicity team. And if people are just sort of off doing their own thing and not telling us when they're giving book talks, or you know, it really works well when we're sort of communicating together on and working together on the book at every stage, collaboratively. That leads to a much more successful outcome for the book.
Yeah. Thank you both. We have time for Q&A. If people have some questions. Yeah.
Well, and a couple of questions. One very practical. You mentioned the philosophy and poetry went by the wayside, and so I'm curious as to what were the kind of larger forces that forced that or resulted in that. And the broader question, I think, is I am a forever ABD person, and when I started a doctoral program, I'm an MFA guy. When I started a doctoral program, I was told, be careful because the scholarly writing is going to destroy your creative writing. It's going to destroy your voice. You talked about bringing in, you know, sort of belletristic and poetry to help cultivate a writer's voice. Is there a point at which you would steer people back toward a more conventional scholarly voice? Is there a way that you might, can you imagine policing a kind of scholarly tone?
I do think you have to, I mean, it's a different situation with your trajectory maybe, but I do think you have to, generally you have to unlearn. If you did finish the PhD, I'm ABD too. Like if you did finish the PhD, you have to unlearn that writing and learn to develop your voice and write and think about reading and writing. I mean, Marissa could talk much more to that. Maybe there is a limit to that. We do need, for a scholarly book, to have a certain amount of scholarly, you know, apparatus. There's an expectation of sources, bibliography, the structure of a scholarly book, but the writing, not necessarily. Yeah. On your other question, just quickly to answer the other question, no press can do everything, right? So we can. I don't do any. You know, I'm the modern history editor. We don't do any Russian history unless it's sort of I sneak it in as world history or something, but we don't do any Eastern European history. There's a separate editor that does Asian studies, you know, but there's whole parts of the world that we don't do at all.
But you used to publish poetry.
We did. We had a really strong, especially California poetry list, and they were prize winning, and we published important. It was sad, but in the end, it was an economic. It was economics. Yeah, we just couldn't sell the books. Same is true a little bit, and it's sad. And I mean, this ties into maybe the discussion about where the industry is with fields that are pertinent to being here. You know, we moved away from African history. I do African history. I sneak it in as part of world history. So I do, you know, I do East Africa. I do the Indian Ocean. And we, you know, we have our anthropology editor also sort of speaks in Africa and various anthropology. You know, so we still do Africa, but we sort of moved away from it as a strong, as a sort of coherent list, because we also just couldn't sell books, and it was sad, and it's. And I do think that outside I mean, I'm gonna get myself into trouble here, but like before, one thing that Hamas did on October 7th was bring Palestine back, you know, and before that, we're very committed to that. I do a New Directions of Palestinian Studies series. I have, we used to publish the Journal of Palestine Studies. You know, we're very committed to that. But our publicists and marketing folk before October 7th were saying, you know, Sarim McDeesy's book that you mentioned, we couldn't sell it. Like, you know, and he writes for The Nation, he writes for Jacobin, he writes, you know, he's a public figure. So, you know, the Middle East is, you know, it goes through ebbs and flows of being on the world stage in these awful, interesting, dynamic ways. But when it's on the ebb, there is a danger of audience, and it's sad too. That does sort of dictate what we can publish.
I mean, to your question, I think that I would be much more interested in working with the author to figure out what sort of publishing house is going to accommodate the voice rather than change the voice of the author, if that makes sense.
I guess I'm also asking from a student perspective, as I'm advising students, right? And what I often hear is, well, this doesn't sound like a scholarly thing. And from my perspective, I'm like, great, we're on the right track.
Well, I feel like you and I share the same sort of
Yeah.
instincts as educators. So, yeah, I would be, yeah, but that's the kind of reader I am.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
I just want to tell everyone who hasn't published with you that you guys are wonderful. Niels and his team are incredibly supportive and give the best kind of advice. And I think you do get authors. I so agree with you. That is the most important consideration as far as I'm concerned. My question had to do with the impact of the political dispensation on funding streams. Has it, maybe you addressed this already in conversations that you've had, but have things gotten worse than they were materially?
I think that, I mean, that has impacted the authors more than the press in the terms of the NEH, you know, cuts in the United States and various grant cuts for their research. You know, there is a sort of long-standing issue of, I mean, it goes back again to book sales, of libraries buying fewer and fewer books, focusing on STEM journals rather than history books, you know, courses, you know, fewer and fewer students, A, enrolling in history courses, B, being able to assign whole monographs in courses rather with decreasing attention spans. I was going somewhere with that. Yeah, so there, it's harder. Oh yeah, it is harder and harder to make the sort of scholarly monograph work financially. One way that we have tried to overcome that for very specialized scholarly books, I mean, I think there's one, you could call it the kind of Brill model, or I mean, I think Cambridge does this sometimes too, is you just price them very high. You do $120 books that are really intended just to sell a couple of hundred copies to libraries. We tried to challenge that by going whole into open access. So instead of the $120 monograph, we give them for free, but then we're looking for funding. I mean, this is only for one sort of very, we're very careful about putting, you know, highly regarded scholarship into that. We don't want open access to be seen as a sort of lesser. So it's perhaps more rigorously peer reviewed, and you know, the scholarly merits of these publications are important, but they're not market driven. We can't sell it. And we're looking for funding streams to help support open access publication for those, which also, again, speaking to regions, enables them to be read by anyone anywhere in the world that has access to a computer, which is great. And we could track that usage and those downloads and see how much this, I think that gives them much wider impact. But again, I think the attacks on the universities, on funding streams, does impact the ability of getting subsidies for these open access.
Yeah, I mean, I would say as a developmental editor, it's killed my business, in the sense that, I mean, if you were charging, and I charge on a sliding scale between, say, 1,500 and 3K for a full, for that artisanal package that I was talking about. And the ways in which most colleagues are able to pay me is through their grants, but as the grants diminish, so too does that. And it's very, it's kind of, and it's also very difficult to figure out how to do this ethically, because in large part, some of the people who could benefit from this sort of work the most are those who are in precarious positions or who haven't yet found an established post. But then it's also really interesting to think about the ways in which people are disincentivized from making investments that would eventually, that are supposed to lead to, say, job security, which is often tethered to a monograph. So I think it's just, it's been really interesting to think about, and I would just say contrast that to, any sort of corporate structure where, it could be charging $500 an hour, right? So it's really interesting to see these ripples that are already happening. And then there's also, I would say, well, you were saying that you've had like a massive number of manuscripts come onto your desk, it's kind of like this final push of being like, well, I've got to get this done. What I've been seeing is that there, on the developmental editing side, that there's more hedging and saying, maybe I should hold off from doing this. Maybe it's finally time to jump this ship. So it's just going to be really interesting to see what happens. I think that there will always be a place for 80,000 words worth of communication about a topic, but it's going to be it's a time of contraction for sure.
A little plug for UC Press. We have a first gen program. So for first generation scholars, we do give them a grant of $3,000 without questions asked for anything, child support, or hire a developmental editor, anything that will help you like get your book finished. And it also has other resources for, sort of demystifying the book publishing process.
That's fantastic. Thanks for that. Other questions?
I have a question. I guess I have two about post-dissertation publishing, and I think you talked a bit about this last year. So and maybe I'll just ask for everyone what are the specific challenges, and I can anticipate them, but for people who are writing second or third books. And then the other question I had is for all of us that end up serving as peer reviewers on both of your sides, what do you see as helpful or unhelpful ways of engaging as peer reviewers? I mean, obviously, aside from just being negative and saying this article or this book is worth nothing, but I mean, ideally, that's a part of this process, and you're depending on people to do this as a service, and we all end up doing it.
It's amazing to me that you do all that. Do it. We do depend on it, but it's a lot of work, and we pay $200 for, but that hasn't gone up in 20 years. So it's sort of, it's not very much money for reading and thinking carefully about a whole manuscript in terms of time. I do find we have to use peer reviewers that have published a book already. They don't have to be assistant professors. They don't have to be associate professors. They have to publish a book, because I do find that, I mean, that's just the protocols that we have. But I actually find that junior peer reviewers are you're still in that grad school mode of picking apart every book and not thinking about how to put a book together. So much less constructive, ironically, even though they're closest to the latest trends in the field, maybe, but really not helpful. I'm looking for people that will be constructive, and seniority seems to to help that. I mean, not always, but sometimes certainly people who have done 2 or 3 books kind of get it and realize that they can really help the author by these sort of just by giving them support, but also sort of just figuring out a couple of things that's not fixed to make it better. Yeah, which was sort of the opposite of what I expected when I started.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I tell my clients that I think that they're ready for peer review when I see a problem, but I don't know how to solve it. And so I look to the peer review process as somebody who's both able to see that glaring issue in the manuscript and then have the scholarly grounding and the maturity to be able to say, here's the issue that I see, here are several different ways in which you could address it. Here's my core question, and here's why I think if you transform this piece, it will make the whole manuscript stronger. And then, I'll often look to peer reviewers to help me know, or help myself know as an author, but also help my colleagues and clients know where great concepts have fallen in and fallen out. So I'm working with a colleague right now who's new to infrastructure studies, but is putting their book in an infrastructure series. And one of the things that we, talked about is the fact that wouldn't it be great to make sure that to get, kind of the peer review quality check, that you've been able to evenly distribute this argument about infrastructure throughout the manuscript. So things like that. In terms of advice for second and third books, do what you want to do and do what you love. There's no, there's no group of, again, the 4 advisors in the quarter, telling you how to make artisanal furniture in their particular style. This is an opportunity to just have fun and let it rip and do exactly what you want to be doing. I think of the artist, Joan Brown, who was a San Francisco-based artist who had very distinct periods of her life. And her whole kind of first iteration of being a painter, which was quite exceptional, really was this really heavy, kind of dark, very modern, thick paint on everything. And she did that for maybe about 10 or 15 years. And then flattened everything, found, bursts of color kind of like this, and became a totally different painter, and fell into her own style. And so I would say that a second book is a chance to figure out who you are, independent of all of the things that you think that you should be. But and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, but then the challenge becomes, now that you have this job, which is, you have all the obligations of the job, and then all the obligations of family and kind of just, this whole weird thing of the midlife. So how do you find a sustainable midlife productivity is also, I think, something that I see with second and third.
I have a question, but you have to forgive me. I'm thinking real time, so there may be offshoots. I'm curious, amongst the authors you've worked with, whether anyone has had their work taken by AI. Because there's a lawsuit in the works currently, and we have colleagues who work here whose books have been swallowed up by AI, and AI is using them. And this is the offshoot. So I'm sort of curious as to, in the future, in the near future, if or when you encounter academics who have started to use AI as, it's a normative. It's sort of like, I remember when I was younger, chess was one of those sports where you could sort of think of Kasparov, for instance, and he'd be challenging Deep Blue, and it was a big deal. But now grandmasters are sort of saying that they've been engaging with computing to sort of master their skills. So if you, in the near future, encounter doctoral students who've just graduated or young academics who've started a relationship with AI and are presenting work to you, how would you potentially engage with them? Because I don't know what my position is. So I'm also curious as to what your position could be, because recently, and I'll end here, there was a writer who used AI to write her novel and she won a prize. And she's been very open about it. So I'm also sort of curious about if you encounter a scholar of great pedigree, but they've been very honest about using AI to further their research, what then?
It's the $20 million question. We are racing to sort of keep up, obviously. I brought my laptop here because we have just, actually in August, we put up a statement on our website about our policy about everybody that uses AI. So we're thinking about authors that might use it. We're thinking about peer reviewers that might use it. We're thinking about copy editors that might use it. So there are all these different stages at which people could be feeding manuscripts into AI in ways that we lose control. The author loses control. And we prohibit that. Whether we can police that or not is another question, I guess. In our statement, we say that we certainly, anybody who's in the press who's working on the manuscript cannot feed it into AI. And including because our copy editors are freelance, so we have a sort of blanket policy for everybody who's working on the book. For the authors, we also sort of insist that they don't use it, but that they're open if they are using it. And similarly with peer reviewers, we insist that they don't use AI, but also that if they do, that they tell us that. I think they said the Anthropic settlement that you were talking about that just happened. So there was they just settled for $1.5 billion with authors and publishers. Because I think my understanding is of the titles that they bought, that they fed into AI, the judge said that was okay. But they also, in their massive push of all these titles into AI, they also fed a lot of pirated copies and a lot of unbought copies. So there's this massive settlement, and I think every author and publisher who finds their work used fed into that data learning module without proper process gets $3,000. So we're sort of in the process of doing that with our authors. It's moving so fast. We do have policies in place, but we're also talking to. Our authors are also often professors who are dealing with that with their students, developing their own AI policies with papers. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, I don't think there's anything to answer. It's more of a statement, really. But there's another lawsuit in the works and I think this is going to be a question for us as well. And full disclosure, we have students in the classroom who are using it. And now the way I grade has changed, because if it's so complete and perfect, it's as though the heartbeat is missing. And all of a sudden I have something else where it's not riddled with mistakes, but it's just different. It feels a bit more honest. But then I've had to have one-on-one conversations with students to sort of arrive at a reasonable conclusion, because I don't know if they've used it or not. So it's extra work. So I was hoping I could steal ideas from you. That's basically what I have.
I could share our policy. We do expect authors to be authors and not AI. So, and that is an obligation that they're signing a contract with us about. And also, we were talking about this a bit last night. I think for primary research, it's easier to see your example about the novel. It's perhaps easier to see that, or for some, for a textbook or something, you can see AI writing a textbook. But for a primary research monograph, it's a little hard. You can see it for doing doing the synthesis work, putting together. But for the primary research monograph, I don't know if we're there yet. I mean, AI could help with the writing, but can it do?
Can it do the thinking?
And also sources with the sorts of sources, raw materials that historians use. If they haven't been digitized, if you have to look for them in dusty brick and mortar archives, you can't really get AI, right? And a lot of archives are too poor to digitize their resources, so we really do.
But I think, I mean, that's such an important point, and I think that is its own danger, that we are seeing. Well, I mean, it's not just AI, but people who are traveling or can access sort of digital archives around the world are privileging digitized sources at the expense of these other important sources that are not, so that there is an inequality that's happening in the research already, that is really, we need to be sort of warned against.
I'm also concerned, back to this question of voice, right? The flattening of the voice of the author.
So we have one question online, and it is actually related to voice. So I'm gonna read it and then paraphrase a little. I'm aware that conveying words depends on each writing style and how to weave your story, but how long or what advice can you provide to get there? That style that captures the author's essence in the book, because passion often is not enough. So it's like advice on how to find your voice as an author in the early or later stages.
You have to start writing. I mean, I think that there's no substitute for writing every day. I think that there's no substitute for, so I can just say that I'll just talk about my own practice of developing an authorly voice over the past 15 years or so. When I started working as an anthropologist at the Uganda Cancer Institute between 2009 and 2012, I was charged with this mandate from Anthropology and Clifford Geertz to just offer a thick description of what I was encountering every day. And I had one senior colleague just pointed to a small Moleskine notebook, and she was like, "You are just going to fill these every single day." And when I got there, I was like, if I try to capture everything, I'm going to walk away with nothing. So what's practical and what's something that I can do every single day? And the target that I wound up hitting the target that I established for myself was 500 words a day. I can do a 500-word document a day. I'll just, at home with a beer, at the end of the day, just write it down. And I look back on my very early 500 words a day, and I can see that I'm writing around my voice. And now this is a practice that I still engage in most every day, after doing, kind of a handwriting clearing. And it's extraordinary to see how over just kind of this daily deliberate practice, a quite distinct authorial voice has emerged. So I think that there's no substitute for practice, and then there's also just no substitute for reading, and being and finding the authors who speak to you, and who move you, and who compel you, and who do extraordinary things with language. And I advise anyone who's in the academy to try to take a writing class with people who are not scholars. Try to get.
Bless you.
No, good far away. Go to New York for a summer and just go to a bunch of book readings. Read some trash. Try to work beyond the constraints of the academic monograph.
I think also going back to a sort of even more basic level, just as the dissertation to book, I think that there's sort of problems that I see that maybe are easily overcomable in terms of forcing you to develop your authorial verse. One is long quotations. Just, you know, when I read a sort of this sort of barely revised dissertation, there's sort of these long quotations, and the author hasn't done the work of just picking out the one sentence that is about their argument, and sort of forcing you to kind of read. You know, you said earlier that report that they were so excited about finding, instead of just giving you the pertinent bit that sort of forces them to make their point about the piece. The other was Joyce Seltzer was a famous editor at Harvard. Was my big competitor for a long time, thankfully retired. So, but she told one of my authors that he would lose half his audience for every historian he mentioned in the introduction of the book. So, you know, if you mention one and then two and then three, you're very quickly down to zero audience, or, you know, a fraction of an audience. So I think that too, you know, when I was saying getting rid of the literature review, if you sort of, at the beginning of your book, get rid of this is the dissertation to book mode, you know, all the other people you're hiding about, it forces you to say what you want to say about the subject, which is part of sort of finding.
Have you found that, I remember this advice about 15 years ago, the introduction to your book should be 5 pages. But I also was given the advice that I had to establish my authority in my monograph as well as in the dissertation. And so that if I didn't have an introduction that worked through the key arguments with which I was engaging, I wouldn't be convincing. Is there a shift that you can see in that parallels tenure reviews with the trends in publication that are being moved along? Because the introduction is often, or historically was, the place where the academic established their relationship to the field. And if they don't do that, is it successful?
And I do think that the introduction, I mean, needs to offer enough to get reader to read the book. So 5 pages might not be enough. I haven't heard the 5-page advice ever. I mean, in general, I think shorter is better, but thinking more like 20 pages rather than 5 pages. So I'm not sure that I've seen it. I mean, the length of books, definitely there's a trend. They're getting shorter and shorter. And we rarely publish a book that's 140,000 words now, and that's our max, including notes and bibliography. So we are looking for, you know, any sort of 120,000 book that can become an 80,000 word book, and that is a big change over the last 10, 20 years. And it's not the cost of publishing it; it's who will read it and who will review it, and that matters. So, but I don't know.
I've never heard that 5-page suggestion before. That sounds really hard.
I didn't take the advice, but I also wrote an introduction that I would never want to read. But it felt like I needed to do it for that stage of my career. And so I guess
we publish, we divide the books that we publish, and probably most academic publishers, we have what we call commercial trade, which are usually not even scholars, they're journalists, they're they're writers. And you know, maybe they would experiment with a 5-page book. Then we have what we call academic trade, which is our kind of fudging category, which is really a scholarly book that is written more accessibly on a topic that's, you know, a hot topic right now that can reach outside the academy, and then our scholarly monographs. And so the introduction would really change depending on who the audience